So the next segment is actually an interview with Dr. Vera Tarman. So Dr. Tarman is the medical director at Renaissance. She is a food addiction expert, an addiction physician, and author of Food Junkies. Dr. Tarman also wrote the foreword to Sandra's book, launching into the world today. Sandra will be interviewing Dr. Tarman, and to give you a little bit more information about Sandra, she is a certified food addiction counselor and a trailblazer in her field. She is the founder of Food Addiction Recovery Program and a best-selling author, Never Enough, 3 Pillars of Food Addiction Recovery. Woohoo! So she's back in the corner there. This is what it looks like. So welcome to both of you.
Yeah, so you all know what I'm going to ask you to do, right? Up on your feet. Come on, let's dance. One more time before lunch. You know the 2 steps. Dr. Tarman picked this song. It's a little bit of a pun.
Oh, honey, honey.
Oh, yeah. Andrew's got the moves. Andrew's bringing it out.
Girl, and you got me wanting
I'm mortifying my daughter right now so much.
honey. Oh, sugar, sugar.
All right, thank you. Dr. Tarman, grab a seat. Let me get. So, thank you so much for joining us here today. It's such an honor and privilege to have you here. And the first question that I want to ask, because for a lot of people in the room today, the term food addiction may not be something they've heard before, maybe a new term. So what can you tell us? What is your most simplest definition of food addiction?
Okay, I'm going to answer that question, but first I want to say this feels an awful lot like an Oprah interview.
Oh, I know. This is the second time I was called Oprah today. I'm like, this is the greatest compliment ever. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to give the short elevator speech definition of food addiction. And this is not the definition of addictive foods. Basically, it's a condition where a person finds they are compulsively eating, and it could be over or under eating, compulsive eating to the point of impairment. And I can give you the longer essay about what that means, but really it's compulsive eating to the point of impairment, and you can't stop, no matter even if there's an impairment.
Yeah, so oftentimes when I work with food addicts, they can tie their weight or their eating to, I don't want to use the word consequence, but they have things happening in their life that they desperately do not want, and yet they find they cannot stop.
That's right, yeah. And if I can just make the distinction that just like Dr. Wharton said earlier, not everybody who has who has a high BMI has metabolic disease or high blood pressure. It's a proportion, it's a large proportion. And similarly with people, not everybody who eats addictive foods becomes a food addict. We probably say, if I can just go on about this a bit, that the statistics are probably around 10, maybe if we stretch it to 20% in the general population who suffer from food addiction. And we're talking about in the Western world where we're eating industrialized foods. But in the obese population, people with a BMI of probably over 35, it's about 50 or 60%. So it's quite high, but it's still not everybody. So I really want to emphasize that food addiction is a condition. But again, also to make the other point, besides the fact that not everybody is a food addict, and you have to determine that for yourself, if those 3 criteria fit. But the other piece that's important is recognizing, oh my gosh, I've lost my thought. Oprah, help me out.
Well, I can move on to the next question.
Okay, but there was something I wanted to say.
It'll
Okay,
come back.
yeah,
it always comes back.
Yeah.
So when I think back to my 20s, when I was looking for help with my weight and my eating, and I knew that I used food in a very similar way to somebody who's living with alcoholism used alcohol. It wasn't that somebody living with alcoholism doesn't just enjoy the odd glass of wine. It becomes problematic, and that's the way food was for me. And so I was seeing a therapist for my food, and I said to him, I think I have food addiction. And he said, oh, did you read that in Cosmo? And I just thought, I was defeated. And why isn't it a widely accepted concept when we go to our healthcare providers?
Okay, good. And I actually remember my point now.
I knew
and
you
that,
would.
And that actually goes to what your
Yeah.
question here, that just eating addictive foods does not make you a food addict. And you know, the food industry, they don't call their foods addictive, but they'll say they're highly palatable. They make you crave, which is just another way of saying addiction. You know, we make it, the food's addictive, so you'll eat more than you really want to. But that's almost all of us if we're eating food in a particular way. But it's like the the drinker may even drink too much because they like the buzz, but they don't all become alcoholics. And so when we don't believe in this concept, it's because we're first of all, we're seeing that in the larger population, 70 to 80% can eat addictive foods and not cross that line. But there is a subpopulation, and unfortunately, people with a BMI, is that causation, is that correlation? Doesn't matter. At this point in the game, it's a high likelihood. You got to think about that as a clinician. Could this be part of the story? But because in the larger population, 70, 80%, you're kind of diluted and lost in the crowd. But the other thing that happens, besides the fact that the numbers, which are increasing, by the way, because foods are becoming ever more addictive, but the other thing that's important is that you just have this. I'll just leave it at that for now. Yeah.
So,
I know. Sorry.
yes, go ahead. Yes,
Sorry.
yes.
Sorry. Thank you. Is that we normalize food. So let's talk about what food is. And a lot of people will say, you can't be addicted to food. You got to eat food. But we're talking about, when we talk about food, we're talking about industrial food products, especially starting with sugar and then any kind of refined carbohydrate. That is not a real food. It's a food product. And we have normalized food products to be food. And so they're going to say, how can you be addicted to food? And you're right. Nobody, tell me somebody who's addicted to Brussels sprouts. Fair enough.
Maybe you.
Yeah.
I feel like the way you talk about Brussels
It's true.
sprouts, it is, you actually got me to eat Brussels sprouts because of the way you described it.
Thank you.
So there might be.
I do have a love affair with Brussels sprouts, especially if they've been caramelized and
Yes.
baconed and all
And,
that stuff.
yeah.
Anyway, let's get off
Onions,
of
yeah,
that
yeah,
topic. We could get into the
We digress.
food porn part. But okay, so basically, that's if we talk about real food, then they could be fair to say, don't be, that's ridiculous.
So-
But we're talking food products which are addictive, and of course they're addictive.
So today is all about shifting perceptions.
Yes.
And so one great shift that we could have is to see real foods that come from nature, single ingredient, as food. And then we see the things that have been chemically engineered, factory made, nutrient poor, disease causing as a substance and not food. And I get it, it's super confusing because a Dorito looks like food. But if you really examine the ingredients, it's more chemical than food. And so, Dr. Tarman, we are facing an obesity crisis. Today in North America, 65% of the population is either living with obesity or overweight. And the numbers are staggering. I saw a statistic that said by 2035, childhood obesity will increase by 100%, which is frightening. And so I wonder if one of the drivers that's gone under the radar is food addiction. Could food addiction be driving this obesity crisis?
Absolutely. Yes, I would say for sure. And part of that is, let's not blame the victim. Let's put the blame where it should be, which is the food industry. The food industry, I don't want to tell you exactly how old I am, but for those of you who can relate, I still come from a period of time where a dessert was had maybe on a weekend and on a birthday, and occasionally you might have a little bit in the evening, but not every day, 3 times a day. Sometimes forget the food, let's just have the dessert. And when a child is being introduced to cereals and candies and having a tantrum at Loblaws because they can't have their thing, and so mom gives it to them, and then there they are standing and the food is right there and they pick it up. The accessibility and the highly palatableness of this is making children addicts. And what does that do? It's not obesity per se, but when you're eating those foods, you're going to, certainly calories in, calories out has some validity, but no matter, I can gain weight on eating way too many Brussels sprouts, but I don't need to eat a lot of cereal and stuff like that to start gaining weight. And so they're eating not only highly palatable, but also highly obesogenic foods. And if we could get that under control before they become food addicts, and it's actually possible, like in my generation, to have a little bit of sweet and not go overboard. So if we could go back to that, I wouldn't be so anti-sugar, but it's so much in our face that I'm now anti-sugar. And by the way, for those of you who have already crossed that line, I'm not saying it's okay to have a little bit, because once you've crossed that line, it's an addiction. And then like any other addiction, once you're an alcoholic, you don't have a little bit of alcohol on the weekend.
Yeah. So we've talked about food quite a bit, and in the food addiction world, we talk about trigger food. So what is a trigger food?
Okay, so thank you. These questions are good, aren't they?
I know this industry.
Yeah, you do. Okay, so trigger foods. We're putting on the realm of addiction, the glasses of addiction. And so when we're talking about trigger foods, there are any cues, physical cues, smell cues in the environment that make me think about that particular food that has gripped my mental real estate. And like I said, you really are not addicted to Brussels sprouts. So if I see one, I might have a pleasant, oh, that's nice. I mean, when you mentioned it, I'm not immediately thinking, I can't wait till I have my Brussels sprouts, which, by the way, I am going to have at lunch.
I knew it.
But I'm not thinking about it right now, except for the conversation. But if I smelled like I think I don't know if they were serving muffins or something, a break, but I could smell something, and immediately, that's a cue. Immediately, I was thinking, oh, that's kind of nice. And I don't want to have that stuff. So it's when there's a cue in the environment that triggers the addiction. And that cue can be a visual, like a look. So people have, when you advertising obviously plays on this. You see something, you immediately want it. So it can be a food cue. It can even be a behavior. It can even be a somatic experience. If I'm used to, when I'm depressed, having a tub of Haagen-Dazs at night, when I'm depressed, what's the first thing I'm going to think about? I have a cue that tells me, I don't know why, but suddenly I'm afflicted with the desire to have ice cream. Let's just have an ice cream and I'll feel better. In the same way as any other thing. So it can be behavioral, visual, semantic, anything that makes me start thinking about food so that it dominates. Because the longer essay about addiction, when I talked about compulsive eating, compulsive means obsessive thinking. And I'm thinking about, as I'm talking to you, if I were food addicted and not in recovery, as it were, I'd be thinking, okay, I'm talking to you guys, but I can't wait until I'm done, and then I'm going to, can we get this over with quickly so I can get going? Yeah. Like, it becomes obsessive to the point where it's affecting my environment. Trigger foods will do that.
Yes, anyone ever heard the slogan, I bet you just can't have one? Anybody know what that's for? Show of hands, right? Potato chips, one of the top three most addictive foods in the world, when they did some research on it. And I basically sum it down to, I never tell my clients what they should and shouldn't eat. It's really about what brings you peace. And so if there is a food that you obsess about, that once you start, it's hard to have a reasonable portion, and it often leads to an overeating episode, that is likely your clue that it is, in fact, a trigger food.
But you would probably say, avoid the refined carbohydrates,
and then
the
I give them a little hint
Yeah.
that they all have sugar. I just give a little hint, but it's always best to have people come to that realization when they put the list together of trigger foods.
And there was a research thing that might be where you were coming from. Just in case you don't know this, it doesn't have to be sugar. Like I remember thinking that, I won't have sugar. I'll have a muffin. That's not as bad. That's pretty much as bad. But do you want to know something? Do you want to know one of the most, within the first 5, I mean, chocolate, that's obvious. Ice cream, that's obvious. What was the one that you said?
Potato chips.
Potato chip, obvious. Pizza.
Yeah.
Pizza's in the top 5.
So I think that's number 1.
It's not overt sugar, but it is highly industrialized and almost sugar.
Yeah. So today, before you arrived, we had a mindful moment because we want to take care of not only our bodies and our minds, but our spirit.
Yeah.
And I know that you can eloquently put into frame why spirituality works.
Okay.
What's the science behind it?
Yeah, so spirituality, there's actually a few things. When we talk about recovery, first of all, recovery means using the addiction model, I want to stop the substance that, I know we're going to talk more about that in a bit, but I want to stop the substance that's causing me grief. But that's only the first step. Now, how do I stay stopped? And there's a few tools that we'll talk about, but one of them is spirituality. And part of this is because when we think about spirituality, that's a sort of generic term. What's happening biologically? So think about your favorite religion, or it could be a 12-step program. It's very oriented. It's not a logical. I mean, people will go, it doesn't make sense to me. I got to see it before I believe it. That's not what this is about. If we want to make it biological, we could see it as almost like a left brain, right brain split. And our discussion right now is left brain, because you're asking me questions and I'm answering. But if I actually really want to teach you something or make a message sink, and you probably know this in your speaking, you want to tell a story. You want to actually tell something, have the person live with you and get it. And so that's right brain thinking. It's the non-linear, lateral type of thinking that happens when we sleep, when we pray, when we meditate, when we sing, when we just go for a walk and turn off the thinking. And that part of our brain has the wisdom. So the left is a closed-minded, let me figure this out, and then the right is that open-minded. You probably know this yourself. When you can't figure something out and you go for a walk, I just can't figure it out. Go for a walk, and then all of a sudden the answer comes to you. It's because the right brain has finally said, "Thank you, Vera. You kept talking. Now I can say something," in the silence between those words. And spirituality just puts you nicely into that left brain. It's metaphor, parables, in the New Testament. In the a 12-step program, I get up and I give you my experience, strength, and hope. My story. I don't say you got to stop. I tell you why when I stopped, I'm better. That's all right brain.
Yeah.
And that's spirituality.
Yeah, I always guide all of my works by one of my favorite quotes by William Goldberg that says, "I have never seen a person grow or change in a constructive manner when motivated by shame, guilt, or hate." And if we look over our histories with trying to change our relationship with food or our bodies, how many times did we start with self-hate? Like every Monday morning, I'd start a new diet.
Right.
It wasn't because I loved myself and accepted myself. Now I'm going to eat Atkins even though I hate it. No, it always started from a place of shame and hate. So is it possible to begin wherever you are, filled with self-acceptance and self-love? Can we start the journey like that, or do we need to have recovery first and weight loss first?
That's a great question too. The thing about opening your day by looking in the mirror and hating yourself, is that you put yourself into a stress response. I look and I hate what it is, and now I'm ready to fight or flight. I'm usually fighting against myself, and I turn again. It's a left brain, right thing. When you're in fight, flight, freeze mode, which happens in the stress response, it brings you to the, how can I figure this out? That's why we can't sleep at night when we're stressed out. We're stuck in this closed-minded system that doesn't allow for new ideas, and you have to be in a place of self-acceptance to be open to new ideas. If I think there's a gun in my face, I don't want to be open. I want to run and fight and close off. So we want to, it's a kind of spiritual act, and I will say to people with addiction, not just food addiction, but any, you have to start with, even if you don't believe it, fake it till you make it, act into right thinking. Look in the mirror and go, I love this person. Even if you don't, stop the negative thinking, and eventually you'll lay the guard down, the new stuff will start to come in. But I will say that you have to then, I'm sorry, this is a have to, that will buy you the time, the openness to do the next step, which is then to say, okay, I recognize this is an addiction, I'm going to stop the offending substance that keeps me in that loop. And so that's the next step. So you have to get out of the food, but in order to get out of the food, you have to be in a positive state of mind.
Yeah. So what would you say are the top 3 tools one can use in recovering from food addiction?
Okay, so I've already said one, abstinence. And well, I guess you could say the preliminary, the pre-stage is the self-acceptance and openness. And you know, this is like trauma work. You go to a trauma therapist, the first thing you don't do is, you know, rip open your wounds and go, look what happened. You spend probably 2, 3, 4 months just building relationship with yourself and with the therapist so that you can then go into the heavy-duty hard work. So the first step, I guess, would be having a good connection with your therapist or in some way a positive, affirming experience. Then you want to move to abstinence. And abstinence is not pretty, it's not easy, but I mean, there's good news to this, which we'll probably hopefully talk about in a second, but it's a bit hard going. I mean, I guess the bad news is it's hard going, but the good news is it's only about 10 days or 2 weeks or something like that. Put down the substance. That's number one, really. Number two, now you want to stay stopped. And that requires a program of some sort. So that could be a program like you have, a program like a 12-step program. It doesn't have to be that. It can even be a religious program. It doesn't matter. You want to have some program that gives you, we call it, you're trying to feed the empty hole in the donut. Is that what it is? The empty heart. You have to have something to put in place of that food. And often you ate the food because you had issues that now you have to deal with. So you need something. How do I live with myself without my favorite drug, which in this case is food? Doesn't have to be. So stop the food. Then what do I do now? And then, so you need to have a program of some sort. And I don't think you can do it alone. So the next piece would be support. Support is absolutely crucial. You and I are in this together. Now, you're a bit ahead of me so that you can give me hope, which is probably the fourth thing. But hope and spirituality are very similar. But you have to have support. Do not do this alone. Do you have a question about that, or should I ask that?
Well, you know what? I just wanted to summarize what you said.
Okay.
So it sounds like abstinence, and then community, and then spirituality, which...
Or abstinence program of some sort to keep
community,
abstinent.
yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
and community.
And then
yeah.
community. So, and I love asking this question of people who have long-term recovery, because over the years I've noticed a pattern that it is the abstinence and the community and the spirituality, which happens to line very closely to the 3 pillars of recovery that I line out in my book. They are exactly like that.
Yeah.
But so if somebody here thinks they are struggling with food addiction, if some light bulbs have gone off, like, where do they get the help?
Well, talk to Sandra, get her book. That's the
Thank you.
easiest way for today. There's, you know, if you'd asked me that question 5 or 10 years ago, I would have said, geez, this is such a hard question. But in the last 5 to 10 years, thanks to social media, it's just exploded, the resources that exist today. We're talking about addiction. There's a lot of resources for obesity. But in the food addiction world, we're kind of a couple of years behind, but we're getting there. So one of the things, I mean, I have my Facebook group, which is
Yes.
free.
It's very good.
I'm Sweet Enough, Sugar-Free for Life. And on there, I have...
Join now. Yeah, it's
yeah,
a great resource. Very active Facebook page.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And on that, we have free groups, like one a day, so that people can just get their feet in, because who wants to put down money if you don't know who the person is, you don't know what you're getting into. It's a way to get free support and also check out resources. And then I have a PDF, and I vet all the people. I make sure they have training in food addiction, or I've spoken with them, so that they're not just trying to sell you something, some product or some gimmick or some whatever, but they get the concept of food addiction. So, and that's a free PDF that I will pass out. And then there's just a lot of people who ask questions. So the Facebook group is one. And then there are now, across the world, programs like Sandra's, outpatient programs, a few inpatient, but inpatient is a hard sell when the government does not recognize and won't fund an inpatient program. Like Sandra and I worked at Renaissance. We had an inpatient program for a couple of years, and it was fabulous.
Yeah. It was very special.
It was fabulous,
Yeah.
but it was funded by a private donor who said, well, you got to pick it up and carry it on, and we weren't able to.
Yeah.
Part of
So-
that was COVID, but it's not funded, and so anyway, we're kind of stuck with using
Yeah.
outpatient stuff, which is pretty good.
So I want to know your why. Why have you chosen to make this your profession, your passion? Why food addiction?
Okay, so that's, you know what? You know how they say, find your passion? like all of you, find your passion, because it will get you through the hard slog. And it's, in a sense, a spiritual process. And so for me, I'm very fortunate because I'm in a position where I can do that. But I have my own history with food addiction. And I got to tell you, I do a lot of stuff in this field. And I keep telling people, if I weren't here talking to you, if I weren't doing all the stuff that I do, the podcast, which, by the way, is another thing, and I've got my book, Food Junkies, don't forget that. If I didn't do all of that, I would have my face in the food eating, and I don't want to do that anymore. But if I'm not a relaxed kind of person. Your mindfulness thing was a bit hard. So I got to do stuff, and I want to do it for a passion, and then it ends up not being work. So I feel very grateful that I have an outlet, because otherwise it would, I don't know, it would be harder to find something. So that's my why. That's my engine of motivation.
So, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to tell you my why, but I have to call my daughter Sophia to the stage. Sophia.
Oh, I should have brought my puppy.
So my why is this beautiful, soon-to-be 12-year-old girl. So this girl is very strong, and she rarely listens to a word I say, but I do know that she is watching me, and she is studying me. And I want my daughter to grow up making her health, her happiness a priority. I want her to love her life and her body. And the only way I can teach her is to show her through my own actions. So she's the dedication in my book, and she's my inspiration because I want her to have complete freedom. And that's it. Thank you. So that concludes, that actually concludes our interview. We're ahead of time because, listen, I get it. The person that keeps you from lunch sometimes is not a good idea. So we're going to take questions now, Rachel? Yes? Okay, we're going to take questions from the audience. Are there any questions online? Oh, okay, great. We have a question here.
Hi.
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 Are you going to ask me a hard question?
Yeah, it looks like, doesn't it?
So, in 1965, 50% of Canadians smoked cigarettes. More men than women, but the average was 50%. Today, 12% of Canadians smoke cigarettes. We can attribute that reduction, presumably, mostly to advertising. But I think the fact that there are still 12% of Canadians that smoke cigarettes speak to a kind of personality trait that is in some people. Some people are obsessive. Some people are compulsive. I don't think that's ever going to change. So my question is, using food addiction as analogous to smoking cigarettes, what do you think is a realistic, both big picture and individual target for eliminating food addiction?
Well, you know, thank you for that question. The connection or the parallel between cigarettes, nicotine, and food is actually very apt. People will say food addiction, sugar addiction, that can't be like an opiate addiction or alcohol, there's no withdrawal. And we say, you know, it's actually more like smoking cigarettes. It's ubiquitous, it's all around, and you do it multiple times in a day. You can not have it, but eventually, by the end of the day, it's gotten to you. So it's a great analogy. So if you're saying that addiction is addiction in the population, and we usually say it's about 10-15% of the population are hardcore addicts, either alcoholic or something, that maybe you're right. Maybe we have to accept that that's the case. But what we're seeing is that because it's almost like, could we prevent, like your daughter, could we prevent people from crossing that line who don't need to have crossed that line? Certainly, genetics are such that there is a genetic predisposition to addiction. If you're not exposed to, cannabis is another one that just scares me because, you know, a lot of people were not smoking because it was illegal. Now they will, and we're going to see more, and we are in the treatment center seeing more people with cannabis addiction. So the more accessibility, the more addiction. So can we then, as a public health measure, at least limit it to that? Because what we're seeing is a population that is, especially as people become, the population becomes more obese, we're seeing rates of food addiction climb along with the obesity. And if we could have stopped the Sophies from crossing that line, let's do that. That would be my argument there. And there's a lot of people that are not quite at that stage. Why, get off the bus before you get to the pre-diabetes and then the diabetes and then whatever else comes next. Get off the bus soon. And the bus is the bus that's driving is not just genetics. It's, as Sean was saying earlier, it's the epigenetics, it's the exposure. If they weren't exposed, they wouldn't have possibly crossed the line.
Thank you. Are there any questions online? Yes, go ahead, please.
Yes, so this is a question from Julia. So why are we as a health industry allowing food fake products like Beyond Meat to be sold, or allowing our soils to be not nitrogen dense anymore?
That's a big, big question, and it's almost like a government policy question.
Yeah, well, I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist here, but I mean, why does the government allow this? It's political, it's economic political, and I think that even people in the food industry that make this stuff will say, I don't eat this stuff myself, I don't let my kids eat this, but it's why do we let the tobacco industry continue? We know about the danger of opiates. Why did we let that continue? We know about cannabis. I mean, why are we letting that continue? I think it's a political question. Outside of my realm, other than I just get very frustrated and afraid.
Okay. Any other questions on? Oh, okay, great. We have some
But we can fight
from
it.
the
Sorry,
audience.
we can fight it.
Fantastic, yes.
Hello. My question is around correlation versus causation. You talk about food addiction, but as a registered dietitian, we really talk about like the relationship that people have with food, how we define food with like good versus bad, and you talk to also children as well, right? How are we raising our children to have a relationship with food and exposing them to things as well? I was wondering if you could speak to that a little.
Well, I thought that was a great statement that you made. So start with the first thing again.
So the first point was just correlation kind of versus causation around foods, like you mentioned things like pizza or potato chips or, sugar sweetened ingredients. Is it these individual ingredients, or are we talking about pizza as a whole, right? Whether it's homemade versus frozen, store-bought kind of thing.
Well, okay, so here's where individuality comes in, and where a person's sensitivity to, I guess you could say, refined carbohydrates. Some people seem to be more sensitive than others. And so you can't make a blanket statement, and I mean, you do that yourself in your program. First of all, there is one good solution, but it's going to scare people away. Have people don't eat sugar, don't eat flour, don't eat refined foods, don't eat industrial foods, just eat real foods. And a lot of people will go with that. But there's a large part of the population that won't go with that and may not need to go to that extent. So if the person is able to have a little bit of sugar, a little bit of cereal or something like that, basically eating the way that we ate even
60 years ago.
60 years ago, where there was some exposure but little, probably we wouldn't have the problem we have today. But the more, we've normalized that it's okay to have a dessert for every meal. That was not normal 60 years ago. And so if we could change the perception and also individualize, because there are some people who simply cannot eat desserts. It would be like the crack cocaine user who's quit, who has a little bit and now they want more. The dopamine reward, the hypersensitivity apparatus is so sensitized, so triggerized, that even a little bit will spark them off. But that's not everybody. And how do I know that? I'll know if I have a little bit and want more and can't stop. But there are many people who can.
And I just
they're not that far down the bus.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on good foods versus bad foods, and definitely in the industry, Dr. Tarman and I try to steer far, far away from that, and rather have it be, is it actually food or is it a chemically engineered substance? And then one step further, I like to take it is it peaceful for you? Because at the end of the day, if this factory made ultra-processed fast food thing is peaceful for you, then there's no problem. So, so it goes back to the patient. Is it peaceful? Is it something that's triggering for you? And does it give you the health that you want? But I don't think there's bad foods per se.
It's a spectrum. And Sandra, you're on one side where you're doing the outpatient care, that sort of like the general population, leading to, and I see the end stage, like the troubled people, the people who are they're obese and they eat and they know they shouldn't, but they still do, and they're so unhappy about that. I see those people, and my suggestion, my solution is going to be different than yours, because on the spectrum there are different solutions.
Yes, I agree. Yeah. Dr. David Macklin had a question. Or maybe Peter did. Sorry, Dr. Peter Selby.
Hi, guys.
Hi.
Hey, Peter. Hi.
Good to see you guys. Channeling Dr. Macklin, actually.
Oh,
No,
I
I'm
see.
kidding.
Sorry, I saw what we're on.
So I hear this, and I'm curious how you situate this approach with the guidelines of medications and others. And is it consistent? Is it complementary? Does it confuse people? How do you approach that? So, for example, people have this trope in their mind about addiction, that it's all about somehow being bad, right? There's a lot of stigma about the word addiction.
Yes.
So can you talk about how you navigate that, and so don't preclude people from taking evidence-based treatments that are out there?
Right. That's a very good point. In the same way that we want to destigmatize weight, I would also ask that we please destigmatize addiction. It's just various levels, and almost all of us have a struggle with something. If it's not food, it's work, or it's cigarettes, or it's something. Let's just destigmatize that. We live in a society where there are so many dopaminergic responses that it's very hard not to be addicted to something. So let's just maybe we can find a different word. That's the first thing that I would say. And then you mentioned about medications. My take on that one is, if a person has the luxury of taking a course like Sandra's, or the various types. I'm only using you because you're here, but you're a great example because you're in Toronto here. But taking some kind of a program and following a food addiction plan, it might very well be likely that you won't require medication surgery. It's possible. If you have the luxury to do so, check it out. But often when people seek treatment, they've now gone to the point where they are going to see a doctor. They've already tried a number of things, and they may not have that luxury. They're already diabetic. They're already suffering from all sorts of other metabolic conditions, in which case the medication and even surgery will, you lose weight pretty quickly, and Sean was giving the numbers, pretty quickly and quite dramatically, and that might get you that initial, first of all, hope, and it might give you the time that because you don't have that much time when you're, having some of these metabolic conditions. You might, I'm sorry to say this, but not make it to the end of the year where you might lose that weight otherwise. So, great. In that sense, I would say it's complementary. But I would say, and I know that, Sandra, you agree with this, it buys you time. It buys you lots of time, but please consider the food, changing the food as well, because you want to sustain and maybe even one day get off that medication, or if not, at least, because we know with bariatric surgery especially, and with the meds, they're too new, so we don't know this as well. Tolerance may develop, we don't know. But weight regain, we call it weight regain, can happen. It can not happen if you follow our plan. So I would say the best approach is complementary if you don't have the time, so that you don't have that weight regain, which is so discouraging.
Yeah. So we'll take one more question, if there is anything online or in the room. No more questions. All right. So I want to thank you, Dr. Tarman, not only for writing the foreword to my book, but coming out here today and talking to us, and hopefully shining a light over this, this very much a disease that needs treatment.